Hey guys, welcome back. Go ahead, dim the lights, pull up that blanket, and let's drift into one of history's strangest side gigs. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or knights, not really. Instead, we're going to hang out with the people who had the weirdest resumes in the medieval job market, executioners. Now, when you hear the word executioner, your brain probably pulls up a cartoonish image of a big guy in a hood, swinging an axe like he's auditioning for a heavy metal album cover. And yes, sometimes they looked like that. But here, the little secret executioners only had actual work on a handful of days in a given year. Beheadings, hangings, burnings at the stake. Those didn't exactly run Monday to Friday like a 9-to-5 office job. So, what did they do the rest of the time? Did they just sit around polishing their axes and humming ominous tunes? Or did they, need to make rent? Spoiler, yes, executioners were basically history's most awkward freelancers. First, let's picture the job itself. Being an executioner wasn't a glamorous posting you applied for. You didn't wake up one morning and say, "Mom, when I grow up, I want to chop heads for a living." Usually, you were forced into it. Maybe your dad had been one, and the role stuck to your family like a bad smell. Maybe you were a criminal who got spared the noose, but only if you agreed to become the guy swinging it instead. Either way, executioners were socially radioactive. They lived on the edge of town, literally. People avoided them in markets, didn't want to shake their hand because superstition said touching the executioner was bad luck. You didn't want to bump into him while buying your bread. It's kind of like how you avoid your ex at the grocery store, except multiplied by curses, bad vibes, and the occasional severed head in his wagon. So outside of chopping days, what did they do? Well, this is where things get weirdly practical. One of their biggest side hustles was medicine. Yes, the guy who just yesterday lopped off your cousin's head might today be selling you a cure for gout. It sounds bizarre, but it sort of made sense. Executioners had access, they handled bodies, blood, organs, and medieval medicine had this idea that human body parts carried curative power. So executioners sold little vials of fats scraped from corpses, powders made of bone, or if you were especially fancy, blood straight from the scaffold. People honestly believed drinking a sip of freshly spilled blood could treat epilepsy. So there's our first image, the executioner, moonlighting as a weird pharmacy clerk. Of course, imagine showing up for your weekly headache remedy, and the guy behind the counter greets you with, "Yeah, this one's from last Tuesday's Heretic. Premium stuff." Not exactly the wellness influencer vibe. Another side hustle, animal control. Executioners were often the ones tasked with killing stray dogs, pigs, or other animals that got too rowdy in medieval towns. And no, this wasn't optional. Someone had to keep the streets clear. Picture the man who once dramatically ended a traitor's life, now running around chasing a loose goat down the cobblestones. It's a bit of a downgrade in drama, but hey, a paycheck's a paycheck. And sometimes, they even handled executions of animals. Yep, medieval courts occasionally put animals on trial. A pig that killed a child, for example, might be dressed in little clothes and hanged publicly, just to make a legal point. And guess who got the gig? The executioner. Which means that in his spare time, he might go from executing a disgraced noble to, say, sentencing a cow. Talk about variety in the workplace. Then there's the construction angle. Executioners were surprisingly handy with woodwork. They had to be, since someone had to build gallows, wheels, scaffolds, and all the other grim IKEA furniture of public punishment. When there wasn't a hanging scheduled, towns might contract the executioner for plain carpentry. He'd be out there building fences, repairing bridges, or putting together stalls for the market. Imagine asking him, "Can you fix my chicken coop?" while trying really hard not to picture the axe in his toolkit. And speaking of tools, executioners were also blacksmiths, sharpening their own blades, and sometimes selling knives or weapons on the side. Because why not double down on the reputation? Nothing says good household scissors like knowing they were made by the guy who beheaded your neighbor last summer. But let's get into the juicy one. They were also tax collectors and garbage men. Yeah, in many towns, the executioner was basically municipal cleanup crew. He would remove dead animals from the street, clear waste, and sometimes collect tolls. The logic was, if people already hated him, might as well pile more unpopular jobs onto the list. So he became this weird combo of butcher, janitor, and government employee. And here's the kicker. because nobody wanted to interact with him directly. Sometimes the executioner could get away with bending the rules a bit, overcharging tolls, skimming off fines. After all, who was going to complain to the sheriff about being cheated by the scary guy with the axe? Social life, almost non-existent. Executioners often lived in their own designated house, is called the executioner's house, usually just outside town walls. If he had a family, his kids carried the stigma too. It wasn't uncommon for executioners' children to marry into other executioner families, because, well, no one else wanted to marry them. That created these weird dynasties of hangmen that lasted for generations. The entire family trees of hereditary axe-swingers, which is not the legacy most people dream of passing down. But here's a strange upside. Executioners were often weirdly wealthy, because while they were hated socially, they were paid decently. Plus, they got to keep clothes and belongings of the people they executed. Yep, the condemned's shoes, tunics, or even jewelry were legally the executioner's. So, in a strange twist, he might show up to Sunday Mass wearing last month's criminal's boots. Medieval thrifting, basically. Let's pause and drift a little deeper into this atmosphere. Imagine walking through a medieval town square in the early morning. The air is damp, the cobblestones slick. In the corner you see a man in rough clothes. Not quite a beggar, not quite a noble. People give him space without even looking directly at him. He's carrying a basket of herbs. But you know, yesterday, those same hands tied a noose. That's the executioner, living in two worlds at once, necessary, but untouchable. And if it wasn't an execution day, he might head home, sharpen his blades, sell some ointments, or maybe spend the afternoon tending his garden. Because yes, executioners often had surprisingly lush gardens. Why? Because no one wanted to walk up to his property and steal vegetables. Fear makes for excellent home security. So, let's gently slide into some examples. In Paris, the official executioner was nicknamed Monsieur de Paris. The job became hereditary in the Sanson family, who ran it for about 200 years. Between beheadings, they literally just ran errands, collected tolls, and went about daily life. One of them even kept a diary that complained about how boring the job was when there weren't enough criminals to kill. Imagine writing, another slow week, only one hanging, hoping for more action next month. Casual. In Nuremberg, the executioner Franz Schmidt kept a meticulous journal of every execution he performed, hundreds over decades. But in between, he was known as a skilled healer. He treated cuts, burns, and joint problems. People came to him not because they liked him, but because he knew the body better than most doctors. The irony of asking the guy who just amputated a thief's hand to come fix your sprained ankle. Very medieval. And here's a final cozy detail for tonight's section. Executioners often developed strange reputations as lucky or unlucky charms. Some townspeople secretly sought them out for charms and spells. A bit of rope from a hanging could supposedly protect you from evil. A piece of the scaffold might ward off nightmares. So while publicly everyone shunned them, privately people snuck over to buy magical little trinkets. The executioner was both a curse and a cure. So, what did medieval executioners do when there were no executions? They gardened. They made medicine. They chased pigs through muddy alleys. They fixed fences, sharpened knives, and sometimes healed the very people who avoided their touch. In other words, they lived very ordinary, very awkward lives, always waiting for the next call to duty, when suddenly they'd step back into the square, put on the mask, and remind everyone why they were feared. And when the job was done, they went back to their gardens, back to their lonely homes, back to the strange quiet life of history's most reluctant civil servants. Hey guys, still here? Good. Let's settle back in, take a slow breath, get comfortable, because now that we've figured out what executioners actually did when they wore swinging blades, let's move into the part that was probably even harder. Existing as human beings in a community that didn't want them. Because if you thought middle school cafeteria politics were bad, try being the guy whose full-time reputation is touch him and you'll get cursed. Executioners were legally necessary, socially radioactive. They were kind of like that one co-worker you really need, because they actually understand the printer. But no one wants to sit with them at lunch. Town councils couldn't function without them. Someone had to enforce justice, but citizens often refused to invite them to festivals, dances, or even church pews. And let's pause here. Imagine trying to go to church with your family on Sunday. You walk in, hoping for a little redemption, and everyone subtly shifts away from your pew, leaving a 5-foot bubble around you. That was the weekly vibe. Executioners were present, but apart, always in the room, never of the room. Marriage was another hurdle. Who wants to marry the local executioner? Answer: usually other executioner families. It created these weird dynastic webs where hangman from one town would marry the daughter of the hangman in another, and so on, until you had entire family trees of hereditary executioners stretching across centuries. A job you didn't apply for, didn't really want, but couldn't escape, because it had become the family business. For example, in 16th century Germany, the famous Franz Schmidt wasn't just some random guy with steady hands. He came from a whole lineage of executioners. His diariist, he kept one listed hundreds of executions with an almost calm bookkeeping style. But in between the dramatic stuff, he wrote about gardening, medicine, and his kids. Just very normal dad content, sandwiched between amputating thieves and hanging bandits. Imagine a medieval bullet journal. Monday, hanged to horse thieves. Tuesday, fixed my fence. Wednesday, daughter's birthday. The weird duality of normal family life mixed with public death work. Now, despite being avoided socially, executioners often became low-key celebrities. People whispered about them, invented superstitions, and ironically sometimes sought them out in secret. Need a potion to ease arthritis? Ask the hangman. Want a charm against nightmares? The executioner might have a scrap of noose rope for you. So you had this bizarre social dynamic, public shunning, private business. Everyone hated the executioner, but also sort of needed him, which is basically the medieval version of we all roast the tax guy, but no one can live without him. Let's also talk about property. Executioners usually lived on the edge of town in designated houses. Not tiny huts either. Sometimes the houses were surprisingly spacious, with gardens and orchards. Why? Because nobody dared steal from them. No one wanted to be caught sneaking apples from the hangman's tree, which meant executioners actually had some of the safest, quietest estates in medieval towns. So while they were hated, they also had privacy. No nosy neighbors popping over. No one cutting through their fields. Just peace, quiet, and an ever-present aura of don't touch his cabbages. But let's float over to the perks of the job. Yes, perks. Executioners often got to keep whatever belonged to the condemned. Clothes, jewelry, shoes, sometimes even horses. So, it wasn't rare to see an executioner walking around in surprisingly stylish outfits, because technically, last month's criminal was now his tailor. Imagine wearing your neighbor's boots after watching him hang. Grim, yes, but economical. In some towns, executioners also got free beer. No joke. Inns were required to serve them without charge, partly as compensation for their social exclusion. So while they might be avoided at weddings, they were never paying for drinks. Small consolation, but not bad. Of course, let's not sugarcoat it. Kids of executioners had it rough. They were branded by association. Other children wouldn't play with them, and apprenticeships were hard to get. Some cities even made laws banning executioners' children from certain trades. It was like a medieval blacklist. Sorry, no shoemaking license for you. Your dad chopped off too many hands. Which is why, as mentioned, most kids ended up marrying into other executioner families or inheriting the role themselves. It was generational pigeonholing. Once your family was in, you weren't getting out, unless you were really good at medicine. This brings us to a fascinating quirk. Many executioners reinvented themselves as unofficial doctors. Why? Because they were experts in anatomy. They knew how to cut tendons, how to sever joints, how to stop bleeding, skills that made them better surgeons than half the university-trained physicians, who were too busy debating humors and astrology charts. Franz Schmidt, the German executioner I mentioned earlier, actually treated over 15,000 patients during his lifetime. Let me repeat that, 15,000. That's a whole medieval hospital's worth of people who trusted the town executioner more than a licensed doctor, which says a lot about medieval medicine, but also about how practical executioners became when no one else wanted their job. So yes, the hangman might cut off a thief's hand in the morning, then sew up your neighbor's injury in the afternoon. One hand chopping, the other hand healing. Strange balance. Another awkward duty, public humiliation. Executioners didn't just kill people, they also carried out punishments like flogging, branding, ear cutting, and parading criminals through the streets. And if you think that sounds like grim work, remember, he also had to clean up after. So one day, he's beating someone at the pillory. The next day, he's carting off animal carcasses. A man of many hats, none of them enviable. And imagine the optics. If you saw him walking toward you in town, you had to wonder, is today the day he's here to fix my broken fence? Or is today the day he's here to cut my ear off? A very stressful neighbor to have. But here's a thought to drift on. Executioners, for all their stigma, were often surprisingly stable. They had steady pay, they had land, they had protections, their houses weren't raided, their gardens weren't robbed, and their families weren't targeted by thieves. In some ways, they lived safer, more predictable lives than farmers who could lose everything in a bad harvest. So while they were despised, they also had a kind of grim security. Let's glide toward one final image before we rest this section. Picture a medieval evening. The market is closing, the sun is low. People carry baskets of bread, goats bleat in the distance, and at the far end of town, you see him, the executioner, walking home alone. Children pull their mothers closer. Merchants stop mid-greeting. No one says a word. He passes by quietly, carrying nothing more than a basket of herbs, maybe a jug of beer from the tavern. Just a man, tired, going home to his garden. But in the silence, you feel the weight of what he represents. A reminder of justice, of death, of society's darkest edge, wrapped inside one very ordinary, very lonely human being. And tomorrow, he might be mending shoes, or amputating a thief's hand, or simply watering his cabbages. That was the life of the medieval executioner, half ghost, half civil servant, never quite fitting into either world. Hey guys, welcome back. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you've drifted into that half-dream space where my voice is just background noise, well, that's pretty much the point. Either way, let's keep going. Because executioners weren't always nameless shadows in the town square. Sometimes, they had names that echoed through history. And not because of charm or good looks. No, usually it was because they had the dubious honor of killing someone famous. Let's start in France. If there's a country that really leaned into executioner dynasties, it was France. And the most famous of them all, the Sanson family. For nearly 2 centuries, yes, centuries, this one family provided Paris with its official headsman. The Sansons weren't just part of history, they basically were history, swinging the axe or dropping the guillotine at some of the most famous deaths UVA ever read about. Charles Henry Sanson, for example, was the guy who executed King Louis XVI during the French Revolution, and Marie Antoinette too. Imagine being so professionally entangled with royalty that you end up killing the king who once might have waved politely at you from a carriage. That's a resume bullet point no one asked for. But here's the thing, the Sansons weren't one-off hired hands. They had their own weird dynastic continuity. Sons succeeded fathers, nephews took over for uncles. Execution was basically the family business, like running a bakery. Except, instead of baguettes, you delivered public beheadings. And of course, the irony, Charles Henry Sanson was said to be soft-spoken, polite, and cultured. He played violin, wore fashionable clothes, and was obsessed with medicine. Exactly the kind of person you'd expect at a Parisian salon, except he couldn't go because everyone knew his day job. Imagine chatting politely over cheese and wine. Someone asks, "So, what do you do?" And you have to answer, "Oh, me, I manage the guillotine." Talk about killing the vibe. Now let's drift further back to England, where the executioners often became infamous, not for their skill, but for their lack of it. Case in point, poor Anne Boleyn. When Henry VIII decided wife number 2 needed to be, well, removed, he called in a French swordsman, because the English axemen were just too sloppy. Think about that. Even Henry, a man famous for being spectacularly indifferent to human suffering, looked at his own executioners and said, "No thanks, these guys are hacks." Literally, the French swordsman came in, gave in a single clean strike, and left. A professional touch. Meanwhile, English executioners were still out there missing necks and hacking away like butchers on discount day. Which brings us to one of the most infamous blunders, the death of Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587. Now, Mary had been imprisoned for nearly 2 decades, which is a long wait for the final curtain. But when it finally came, you'd think Elizabeth I's government would have lined up the best man for the job. Instead, they got an executioner who needed 3 swings to do it. 3 And because medieval history has zero chill, contemporary accounts claim he ended up holding up Mary's severed head by the hair, only for the head to fall to the ground because it turned out she had been wearing a wig, which, if nothing else, proves that wigs in Tudor England were surprisingly good quality, but still, not exactly a graceful ending. And the executioner, let's just say no one sent him a well-done fruit basket after that performance. Speaking of shaky hands, let's pause at another famous case. Thomas Cromwell, Henry VIII's chief minister, the guy who basically engineered England's religious reformation, ended up on the chopping block himself. Poetic justice and all that, except his executioner wasn't exactly up to the task. Reports say it took multiple blows. Cromwell's head became more of a demolition project than a clean separation. The crowd was horrified, and the executioner's career, if you can call it that, was basically done. Nobody likes a messy job, especially when the job is already horrifying. But fame wasn't always about failure. Some executioners were so precise, so efficient, that people admired them in a weird, backhanded way. Take the Nuremberg executioner Franz Schmidt, who I mentioned earlier. He kept a diary, meticulously recording every punishment he delivered. His handwriting was neat, his tone was flat, and he treated executions the way most of us would treat balancing a checkbook. In his career, he carried out 361 executions. He also flogged, branded, or mutilated hundreds more. And yet, when you read his diary, there's this sense of quiet professionalism, like he considered himself less a killer and more a bureaucrat with a sword. After retiring, he was actually pardoned by the emperor and lived out his days as a respected healer, which means oddly enough that the hangman of Nuremberg ended up with a more peaceful retirement than most peasants. And then we have the rare cases of executioners who became political pawns themselves. During revolutions or rebellions, executioners were sometimes forced to kill people they personally knew or even admired. Refusal wasn't an option, which meant some of them lived with quiet guilt. Others leaned into cynicism, and a few actually used their position to sabotage the process. One story from the Dutch Revolt tells of an executioner who pretended to botch a hanging, giving the condemned just enough chance to escape in the chaos. Heroic in the moment, though probably a death sentence if his employers ever found out. But let's not romanticize for every famous executioner. There were hundreds whose names are lost, remembered only as the man with the axe or the town hangman. They existed in this odd grey space, feared, gossiped about, occasionally praised for efficiency, occasionally cursed for clumsiness. Their lives were public and yet strangely invisible. Everyone saw them in the square, but no one invited them over for dinner. Everyone whispered their names, but no one wrote them down unless they botched a job or killed someone famous. And maybe that's the truest legacy of executioners, to be necessary, unforgettable in the moment, and yet destined to fade into the background of history. So as we drift further into this, let's prepare to slide toward their other duties, the strange punishments, the odd side hustles, the moments where they weren't just executioners but general-purpose enforcers of civic order, because beheading was only the beginning. So, picture this. You're living in a medieval or early modern town. The law says you've committed some crime, but lucky for you it's not serious enough to warrant losing your head. That's the good news. The bad news, the punishment still has to be visible. Something that says to the whole town, don't do this, or you'll end up like this person. And guess who's in charge of making sure that little morality play gets staged? Yep, the executioner. Let's start with flogging. Not glamorous, not subtle, and definitely not quiet. The convicted criminal, who might be anything from a thief to someone accused of spreading gossip, yes, seriously, would be tied up, and the executioner would deliver lashes. The crowd got to watch, because nothing says family-friendly Saturday afternoon entertainment like watching your neighbor get whipped until their back looked like a butcher's stall. Executioners weren't exactly free to choose how hard to swing, though local laws often specified the exact number of lashes, 20, 40, 100. Sometimes they had to pace themselves to avoid accidentally killing the person before the quota was reached. Because imagine the paperwork if you're told 40 lashes and you swing too hard on number 39. Now, if flogging sounds bad, branding was worse. Branding, iron, heated until it glowed, pressed into the skin, usually on the cheek, forehead, or hand. The idea was simple. Create a permanent marker so everyone in the village could immediately see what kind of person you were. Ah yes, This one here has a nice crisp T burned into their skin. That stands for thief. Wouldn't buy butter from them if I were you. And of course, who applied the iron? The executioner, because apparently one of the perks of the job was doubling as human cattle branding technician. Some regions even had a charming innovation called the hot iron kiss branding on the lips. Subtlety was not the Middle Ages' strong suit. But let's not stop there. Executioners also oversaw mutilations, which sounds horrific, but again keep in mind, this was all about visible, symbolic punishment. Someone caught lying might lose an ear or have it nailed to a post for an hour before being cut free. A forger might lose a hand. A slanderer might have their tongue snipped or pierced. It was about turning the body into a billboard of crime. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Did executioners train for this? Did they go to some medieval trade school for amputation and humiliation techniques? Nope, they just sort of learned on the job. Which means results varied. Clean slice, maybe. Jagged mess, also maybe. It really depended on the steadiness of your local hangman's hand that day. Then there were the public humiliations, the kind of punishments that didn't leave scars but did leave memories, like the cucking stool, where the convicted, often women accused of gossiping, nagging, or suspected of witchy behavior, were strapped to a wooden chair and dunked in water, again and again. The executioner handled the dunking, pulling ropes or pushing beams, while the crowd jeered. Or the donkey parade, which was exactly what it sounds like. Offenders, especially men accused of domestic violence or cheating tradesmen, would be paraded through town riding backward on a donkey while wearing a silly hat or carrying something ridiculous. The point was maximum humiliation, and once again the executioner had the reins, literally, because when it came to organized embarrassment, he was basically the stage manager. And let's not forget about the pillory. You know, the image wooden boards clamping someone's head and hands in place in the town square. The punishment wasn't just the discomfort of standing there, it was the public's chance to, let's say, interact. Rotten food, mud, stones, even the occasional dead animal, all thrown at the helpless convict. The executioner's role: he set it up, locked the person in, and sometimes encouraged the crowd to participate. Which makes you wonder if he got hazard pay, considering he was usually within range of the flying turnips. And then, the darker sides. Executioners sometimes carried out punishments that today we call torture, but back then were simply considered justice. Stretching on the rack, thumbscrews, hot pincers. If the court wanted someone persuaded to confess, the executioner was the one with the toolkit. It's worth noting, though, that not every executioner was a sadist. Many seem to have treated torture as just another job requirement, doing what was ordered without personal enthusiasm. In diaries and records, you sometimes catch a tone of weariness, almost boredom, as if to say, yes, I dislocated another shoulder today, same as yesterday. Can we please be done with this nonsense? But the strangest part of all these extra duties, they blurred the line between executioner and healer. Remember Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg guy who kept a diary? Well, when he wasn't beheading people, he was often asked to set bones or treat wounds, which is ironic, to say the least. The same hands that broke your arm yesterday might fix it tomorrow. Executioners were sometimes the only people in town who understood anatomy well enough to handle basic medical procedures. They had practical knowledge of cutting flesh, binding wounds, and dealing with infection, which meant, if you had a nasty injury, you might just swallow your pride and shuffle over to the guy who hanged your cousin last week. Talk about awkward doctor-patient dynamics. And here's the kicker. For all this work, executioners weren't exactly rolling in wealth. Sure, they got paid, but often, the payments were irregular, delayed, or downright stingy. Some towns gave them the clothes of the condemned as part of their fee, which sounds practical until you realize that those clothes might have been ragged, filthy, or bloodstained. Great, thanks. Just what every man wants, a second-hand tunic from someone who was just hanged in it. Others were paid in food, wine, or fuel, basic survival stuff, which kept them alive but rarely comfortable. Unless, of course, they leaned heavily into those side hustles we mentioned before, selling herbs, performing cheap medical treatments, or, yes, even dabbling in under-the-table criminal work themselves. Because when society pushes you to the margins, sometimes you push back. So when we ask, what did executioners do when there were no executions? The answer is, they flogged, they branded, they amputated, they dunked, paraded, humiliated, and occasionally patched people up afterward. They were the one-man judicial circus, called in whenever society wanted to make a point, and while none of it made them popular, it did keep them necessary. And as we drift forward, let's shift our gaze to another corner of their world, their personal lives. Because if you thought their professional duties were strange, wait until you hear how they lived day to day, how they tried to raise families, and how their children inherited both the stigma and sometimes the job. So, imagine this: you're an executioner. You spend the morning branding a thief's hand, the afternoon dunking someone in a river, and then, at dusk, you trudge back to your modest house, and what greets you there? A family, a wife, children, maybe a chicken that somehow always manages to escape the pen. Executioners didn't live in complete isolation, not physically, anyway. Most towns provided them with houses, though often at the edge of the community, near the gates or the graveyard. You know, the real prime real estate. Nothing says welcome home like living next to a cemetery. But neighbors weren't lining up to borrow sugar from the hangman's wife. Families of executioners were treated as contaminated by association. That meant limited friendships, limited social options, and yes, marriage prospects for their kids that were about as bright as a candle in a rainstorm. The family business nobody wanted. Here's the catch: execution was often hereditary, not by legal requirement, but by practicality. Why? Because nobody else wanted the job. So when an executioner died, the most likely person to pick up the axe or rope was his son, sometimes a brother, sometimes even a son-in-law. Basically, if you were related, congratulations, you just inherited a career you never asked for. In fact, many executioner dynasties stretched on for generations. Think of the Schmidt family in Nuremberg. Franz Schmidt, a diary-writing executioner, was the son of an executioner himself. He tried hard to make sure his kids could break free of the stigma, but in many families, the cycle just kept going. Executioners, kids at school, and here's a weird little note. In some towns, executioners' children weren't even allowed to attend the same schools as other kids. They were seen as tainted. Imagine being 6 years old and already blacklisted because of your dad's job. This created an odd ripple. Some executioners ironically ended up educating their kids better than other families because they hired tutors at home. A few kids even slipped into other respectable professions: medicine, law, even clerical work. But they usually had to relocate to another town because locally they'd always just be the hangman's boy. Loved marriage and the awkward wedding invitations. Finding a spouse was, predictably, difficult. Who wants to marry into a family everyone whispers about? So executioners' families often intermarried with other marginalized groups: knackers, tanners, gravediggers, even lepers' families. Basically anyone society already shoved to the edge. Over time, this created what some historians call executioner clans, networks of families tied together by marriage and profession, sharing the stigma across regions. Imagine an extended family reunion where everyone in the room has, at some point, been paid to chop, brand, or bury. The wife's role. Executioners' wives deserve their own moment here. They weren't simply silent partners. Often, they handled the household business side of things, selling the remains of animals, running herbal shops, or acting as midwives. Yes, you heard that right. In several towns, the hangman's wife doubled as the local midwife, which made for some pretty surreal family resume entries. Husband performs amputations and executions. Wife delivers babies. Together, you're one-stop shop for life and death services. The irony practically writes itself. Family reputation despite the stigma. There were cases where executioners and their families earned grudging respect. Some were seen as reliable, disciplined, and oddly trustworthy, precisely because their position made them untouchable. Nobody suspected the executioner of petty theft, for example. He already lived on society's fringe, and breaking small laws would have been a quick way to lose even the little security the job offered. That didn't mean their kids had it easy. Children of executioners often grew up in a strange half-world, feared by some, mocked by others, and constantly reminded that their last name carried baggage heavier than any axe. The executioner look. Here's a fun detail from records. Many people claimed they could spot an executioner just by appearance. The stereotype: broad shoulders, grim expression, hands like shovels. Whether this was accurate or just the result of centuries of gossip is debatable. But one thing's for sure: executioners carried themselves differently. You kind of had to. when everyone stared. It's no wonder their kids sometimes grew up defensive, quick to fight, or determined to prove themselves in other professions. The stigma wasn't just a job hazard, it was a family inheritance. After hours, what did they do for fun? When executions were rare, when the punishments were done, what then? Executioners and their families had free time. Records hint at musics. Some executioners played instruments, like lutes or fiddles. They drank a lot. In some accounts, they tended gardens, raised animals, or fished. In other words, they were surprisingly normal at home, except of course, when their hobbies included keeping curiosities. Some executioners were known to collect relics from their work skulls, bones, ropes, even the axe blades used in notable executions, kept at home, sometimes displayed, sometimes sold. Talk about a conversation starter for dinner guests. Passing it on for children. Growing up in this household meant one of two futures: accept the family trade, pick up the tools, continue the cycle, or escape by marrying out, moving towns, or reinventing themselves elsewhere. The first option brought money and security, but also stigma. The second brought freedom, but usually poverty and struggle. A lose-lose game, unless you got very, very lucky. Franz Schmidt's children, for example, did manage to step out. His reputation as a careful, respectable executioner helped them gain positions as artisans and doctors. But they were exceptions, not the rule. So when we look at executioners at home, the picture is one of contradictions. They were feared and hated but depended upon, shunned socially but essential professionally, carriers of stigma, but also guardians of the law. And their families lived in that tension every single day, eating meals, raising children, tending gardens, all under the shadow of a rope. And now, as we drift further, let's move our lantern light to another dimension, the cultural myths and legends surrounding executioners. Because while they lived very human lives, society wrapped them in superstition, rumor, and half-believed tales. From magical powers to cursed bloodlines, let's ease into that next. So, picture a medieval tavern. It's smoky, it's loud, people are drinking ale out of wooden mugs, and in the corner, someone inevitably starts telling a story. And who pops up in these stories more than you'd think? The executioner, not just as a man with a job, but as a figure cloaked in mystery. Because here's the thing, when society doesn't like someone, it often makes up stories about them. And executioners had centuries worth of stories, some flattering, some ridiculous, and most somewhere in between. The healing touch of the hangman. This is probably the strangest and most contradictory superstition. Executioners, men who cut off heads, broke bones, and burned heretics, were also believed to have magical healing powers. Yes, you heard that right. In several parts of Europe, people thought the touch of an executioner could cure illness, epilepsy, boils, tumors, even gout. If the hangman touched you, you might be healed, which is ironic, considering being touched by him professionally usually meant the opposite of healing. But there was logic behind it, at least medieval logic. Executioners were constantly around blood, bodies, and suffering. People believed this gave them some special connection with life and death, a kind of mystical balance, where they could channel power back into the living. In Germany, some executioners doubled as bone setters and healers. They set broken limbs, they provided potions, and patients came willingly. Imagine walking into the executioner's house and saying, "Yes, I'd love for you to realign my shoulder. Please ignore the axe hanging above the fireplace." The executioner's rope, a lucky charm. Now let's talk about ropes. Specifically, ropes used in hangings. It turns out, these ropes were in high demand, not by other executioners, but by ordinary people who believed a piece of the noose carried magical properties. Gamblers tied bits of rope around their wrists for luck. Farmers buried them in fields for good harvests. Lovers kept them as charms. Yes, nothing says romance like gifting your sweetheart a piece of hemp soaked in a stranger's last moments. The trade in hangman's rope was so brisk that some executioners made a side business out of it. One account from England notes that ropes were cut into tiny pieces and sold at markets like holy relics, which tells us two things. Superstition runs deep. Executioners never missed a chance for extra income. The curse of the hangman's blood. On the darker side, there were also myths about executioners being cursed. People whispered that their bloodline was tainted, that the children of executioners carried bad luck, or worse, that they were doomed to die violently themselves. This fed into the stigma we talked about earlier, the idea that being born into the family meant inheriting not just a job, but a supernatural stain. Some towns even had rules banning executioners' children from certain professions, because they were untrustworthy, not for any actual crime, just for existing in the wrong family. It was medieval HR at its finest. Executioners and the devil. And of course, we can't skip the classic medieval rumor. Executioners had a special relationship with the devil. After all, who else could stomach the work of killing for the state? Clearly, whispered the townsfolk, Satan himself had given them strength. This wasn't just background gossip. In some witch trial records, accused witches tried to deflect blame by claiming executioners were the ones who dealt with demons, which is kind of bold, like standing in court and saying, "Oh me, no, I'm innocent. But the guy who chopped heads last week, definitely in league with the devil." The dream symbol executioners even appeared in medieval dream books. Yes, those weird guides that told you what your dreams meant. If you dreamed of a hangman, it was a bad omen. It meant betrayal, punishment, or impending sickness. Unless, of course, you dreamed he was touching you gently, then it might mean healing. Because medieval dream logic was nothing if not flexible. So the executioner wasn't just a person in your town. He was also a figure in your imagination, haunting your dreams, your dice games, your farming rituals, and your bedtime stories. Legends of the merciful hangman now. To balance the superstition, let's glide into a softer corner. The stories of executioners who showed mercy. Folklore sometimes painted them as grim but kind-hearted figures, men who whispered last words of comfort to the condemned, or who gave a quick, clean blow when others might have drawn things out. One German ballad tells of an executioner who secretly let a prisoner escape, taking the blame upon himself. Was it true? Probably not, but people liked to imagine that even the hangman, the man of death, might still carry a hidden spark of humanity. Executioner as folk hero in some villages. The executioner even slipped into the role of a folk hero. Someone outside the law, feared and hated, but secretly admired for his courage and strength. It's not unlike how outlaws sometimes became legends. People may despise them in reality, but in stories, they gain a strange dignity. And so, centuries later, executioners appear in plays, novels, and tales not just as villains, but as complex figures. So when we talk about executioners in myths and legends, we see the human mind doing what it always does, taking someone mysterious, filling the gaps with stories, making them larger than life, from healer to cursed outcast, from devil's servant to unexpected savior. The executioner became all of these, depending on who was telling the story. And as we drift further into the late medieval and early modern world, let's carry these whispers with us. Because executioners weren't just practical figures, they were cultural symbols. And their story doesn't end in folklore. In fact, as Europe marched into the 16th and 17th centuries, executioners began to evolve again. Some became surprisingly powerful. Some gained wealth. Some even found respectability. Let us float there next into the age when the executioner became not just a feared tool of justice, but a semi-professional, semi-respected, almost bureaucratic figure. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, say the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was slowly reinventing everything. Printing presses, gunpowder, fancy collars that looked like someone glued a doily to your neck. And yes, even executioners, because as justice systems grew more complex, so too did the need for someone to reliably swing the sword, tighten the rope, or stoke the flames. This wasn't just about punishment anymore. It was about spectacle, consistency. The state needed its executions to look orderly, predictable, and terrifyingly efficient. And so, the professional executioner was born. A job with a contract. By this era, many cities hired executioners on official contracts. They were no longer just shady outcasts or men coerced into the role. They became municipal employees, paid salaries, assigned duties, sometimes even given uniforms. Imagine getting your paycheck and thinking, good. That should cover rent, bread, and the sharpening stone. Some towns even built executioners' houses, usually just outside city walls, close enough to call in when needed, but far enough away so the neighbors didn't have to awkwardly greet them at the market. Expanding duties, more than just killing, early modern executioners had a whole menu of services. Of course, they executed criminals, but they were also in charge of torture sessions during interrogations. branding and mutilation punishments, like cutting off ears or noses, animal control, which could mean killing stray dogs or dangerous livestock, cleaning duties in prisons and hospitals, because apparently nothing says skilled labor like forcing the hangman to mop floors, and, in some cases, they even worked as doctors. Yes, this is the strange part. Executioners were often some of the most medically skilled men in town. Why? Because they had extensive knowledge of anatomy. They saw the insides of bodies on a regular basis, whether through dissection or decapitation. They knew how bones fit, how muscles worked, and how to stop bleeding. So, many executioners quietly doubled as surgeons and healers. They set broken bones. They drained abscesses. They treated wounds. It sounds bizarre, but it actually made sense. If you wanted someone who understood the human body and wasn't squeamish, the executioner was your man. Of course, this put society in a bit of a bind. On one hand, people whispered that executioners were cursed, filthy, or demonic. On the other hand, if you broke your arm, you might find yourself knocking at the hangman's door for help. Hypocrisy, absolutely, but also survival. Executioner dynasties. Another trend in this period was the rise of executioner dynasties. Families like the Sansons of France held the role for generations. From the 17th to the 19th centuries, the Sanson family provided 6 consecutive executioners in Paris. They became minor celebrities, almost like a grim aristocracy of death. It's strange to think of, but within their circles, these families had respect, wealth, and influence. They carried secrets of the trade, passed from father to son, sharpening not just blades but reputations. Imagine growing up with your father saying, "Son, one day this axe will be yours. Now run along and practice your swing." It was morbid, but it was stability. In a society where many struggled for consistent work, executioner families had a steady, if eerie, legacy. The paradox of respectability. Despite their usefulness, executioners were still caught in a paradox. They had official salaries, they had contracts, they had families, some even owned land, and yet, they were still ostracized socially. People didn't want to sit next to them at church. They avoided shaking hands. They crossed the street when the executioner walked by. It was as if society collectively said, "We need you, we'll pay you, but we will never like you." And yet, the state kept promoting their work as essential. Executioners were no longer random figures of terror. They were symbols of law and order. Public performance. Early modern Europe loved a good show, and executions became elaborate public performances. Executioners had to be skilled, not just with their tools, but with timing. A swift, clean execution could enhance their reputation. A botched one could ruin it. Crowds gathered to watch, sometimes in the thousands. Vendors sold food and drink. Children sat on shoulders. People placed bets on whether the condemned would scream, faint, or resist. And in the middle of it all, the executioner was the star performer, hated, feared, but absolutely necessary for the show to go on. So by the 17th century, the executioner had transformed from a despised outcast, barely tolerated at the fringes, into a state employee with pay, duties, and even a strange form of respect, not quite accepted, not quite rejected, living in that uncomfortable middle ground where society needed their labor but refused to embrace their humanity. As we drift onward, let us slip into another angle of their lives, how executioners actually felt about their own work. Because under the contracts and the public spectacles, they were still human beings, and some of them wrote about it. Next we'll float into part 8, inside the mind of the executioner, letters, memoirs, and quiet confessions. So, let's take a break from all the torture devices and criminal justice admin, and think about something just as weird, the executioner's social life. Spoiler alert, it wasn't exactly glamorous. Executioners often lived on the literal edge of town. Not figuratively like, oh, he was a bit of a loner. No, literally, on the edge, usually near the town walls or outside the gates. Why? Because nobody wanted to bump into them while buying bread. The guy who beheads people for a living isn't exactly best neighbor material. Imagine living next to someone whose job involves bringing home rope, blood-stained clothes, or occasionally awkwardly animal parts. That's not the guy you ask to water your plants while you're away. And in many towns, they weren't even allowed to mingle freely. Executioners, along with gravediggers, butchers, and prostitutes, were considered unclean. They might have been essential for society's functioning, but they weren't considered respectable. It was this strange double life. Town officials wanted them close enough to do the dirty work when needed, but distant enough to pretend they didn't exist the rest of the time. This also meant their children grew up socially stigmatized. A son of an executioner was, well, expected to be an executioner. The profession was often hereditary, not because little Hans dreamed of becoming an executioner when he grew up, but because realistically, who else was going to hire him? No guilds, no churches, no noble families were keen on associating with the bloodline of death, so entire families became dynasties of executioners. It was like a really macabre family business. Instead of Smith & Sons blacksmithing, you had Schmidt & Sons beheading services. Some executioners leaned into this role. A few families became somewhat notorious, even respected in a strange way. People might have whispered about them, but they also needed them. It's like when you don't want to think about the person who cleans out septic tanks, but the moment yours backs up, suddenly you're their biggest fan. But socially, it was isolating. Executioners often had trouble marrying outside their own profession. So, yes, executioners frequently married the daughters of other executioners. It was easier. They understood the stigma, they had similar lifestyles, and, let's be honest, nobody else was queuing up to marry the guy who keeps a collection of torture hammers in the shed. Now, when executioners did have social contact, it was usually awkward. Townspeople might ask for medical advice because, weirdly, executioners were sometimes also folk healers. They knew anatomy better than most people, since they had, well, hands-on experience. That meant they occasionally acted as surgeons, bone setters, or even herbal healers. Imagine the scene. A farmer limps up to the edge of town and says, "Hey, hair executioner, I know you chopped off my cousin's hand last year, but my leg's broken. Can you fix it?" And the executioner probably could. He was like a dark version of a medieval family doctor/handyman. When there were no heads to chop, no thieves to flog, he patched people up. Which, if you think about it, is hilariously ironic. The same guy who might break your bones one week could be called to reset them the next. Let's not forget festivals. Believe it or not, executioners were sometimes required to take part in town pageants, parades, or public entertainments. Not front and center though. Usually, they played background roles like executioner-themed mascots. Some were even asked to perform tricks like throwing axes or showing off sword skills, which, okay, sounds cool at first until you realize the guy's day job is cutting open criminals. That kills the vibe a bit. And then there was the drinking. Executioners were stereotypically heavy drinkers. Was this a cliché? Yes. Was it true? Also yes. When your job is hated, when everyone avoids you, and your free time consists of polishing swords and boiling rope, ale starts to look like a good friend. Some cities even paid part of the executioner's salary in beer, because, apparently, no one thought this might make things worse. The irony here is that, while they were socially isolated, executioners often knew everything going on in town. Criminals gossiped when being punished, drunks confessed things in the stocks, nobles whispered bribes before their sentencing, and commoners, desperate for medical help, spilled their secrets while getting patched up. The executioner was like the creepy town archive. Everyone avoided him, but he probably knew all the dirt. So, if you're picturing the executioner sitting outside his lonely little house on the town edge, polishing his axe in the evening sun, while nobody comes over to borrow sugar, that's not far off. It was an awkward existence, a lonely one, and yet, somehow necessary. And with that, let's quietly wander away from their awkward barbecues and head into another part of their world. Because when executioners weren't avoiding their neighbors or sewing up wounds, they had another big responsibility: keeping track of justice itself. So, when we think of executioners, we usually imagine them swinging a big axe or pulling a lever, and that's about it. But in reality, a surprising amount of their time was spent not killing people, but writing things down. Yes, the guy society thought of as the creepy outcast was also, sometimes, the town's unofficial accountant of death. Executioners often kept what were essentially execution logs. These were detailed notes on who was punished, for what crime, and what method was used. In some cases, they even added little personal touches like this one fainted before the second blow, or took longer than expected. Morbid. Absolutely. But for medieval towns, this was valuable legal evidence. You couldn't just say, "Oh yeah, I think we hanged that guy last week." No, the authorities needed records. And since the executioner was right there, axe in hand, he became the natural choice to write them. These records, often called Scharfrichtebuch in German-speaking lands, were basically grim spreadsheets. Imagine flipping through pages of beheaded check whipped, check broke on the wheel. Messy, but check. It was, in its way, one of the most chilling but organized jobs of the Middle Ages. But this paperwork extended beyond executions. Executioners sometimes acted as low-level legal clerks. Need a body examined after a mysterious death? Call the executioner. He was considered experienced enough in anatomy to give a kind of protopsy. Need property confiscated after a criminal conviction? The executioner was there to tally up the goods. Need a witness to make sure justice was properly carried out? Again, the executioner was the guy with the notebook. This made them, ironically, part bureaucrat, part enforcer. On one hand, they were feared and shunned. On the other hand, towns literally relied on their records to prove the justice system was working. And because executioners were often literate, remember, they came from executioner families and passed the trade down. They could handle this paperwork when many ordinary citizens couldn't. Even sign their names. It's strange to think about, but the man sharpening a sword outside of town might also be one of the best street people around. Of course, this led to some amusing contradictions. People who wouldn't dare speak to an executioner at the market might still rely on his written testimony in court. Judges quoted executioner logs as legal proof. City councils filed them away in archives. But heaven forbid you invite the guy over for dinner. And sometimes, these records became famous in their own right. A few executioner families passed down journals for generations, which today give historians a weirdly intimate look at medieval justice. They didn't just write executed thief. No, some executioners added commentary. Things like, he begged a lot, or she was very brave. One German executioner, Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, kept an enormous diary of his work between 1573 and 1617. He executed 361 people and flogged or otherwise, punished nearly 400 others, and he wrote it all down, carefully, almost clinically. By the time he retired, his log was less a work diary and more of a grim family album. Now, it's worth noting that some executioners really leaned into this paperwork guy role. They liked the authority it gave them. Others hated it. After all, they weren't respected officials, they were still shunned. So imagine being forced to write neat records for people who wouldn't even stand within 6 feet of you at church. It must have been one of the more frustrating contradictions of the job. But that's what makes the life of an executioner so oddly compelling. They were outcasts, yet indispensable. They were feared, yet relied upon. They weren't invited to dinner, but their handwriting might have ended up in the most important legal cases of the city. So yes, when there weren't heads to chop, there were papers to file. The sword in one hand, the quill in the other. Not quite the glamorous image we think of. More like a strange mix of medieval HR and accounting, but with a splash of blood on the ledger. And speaking of double lives, let's drift over into yet another side of their existence. Because when the sun went down, and when there were no punishments to oversee or records to keep, executioners sometimes had side hustles. And these weren't your normal medieval side hustles. No, executioners often found themselves in some very unusual side businesses. Alright, so we've established that executioners had awkward social lives, dabbled in paperwork, and were sometimes forced into mini medical careers. But even beyond that, they had to make a living in ways that weren't exactly advertised in the town brochure. Yes, the executioner's salary existed, but it wasn't always enough to keep the family fed, or the ale flowing, or the sharpening stones polished. Enter the side hustles. Now, these weren't exactly corner coffee shops or artisanal candle making. Executioners' side hustles were, unsurprisingly, morbid, practical, and occasionally profitable. Selling animal hides. One of the most common extra gigs was dealing with animal hides. Stray dogs, cows, horses, whatever was sick, dead, or deemed dangerous in the village of Fon ended up in the executioner's hands, because they were already handling corpses, removing limbs, and cutting things apart. It made sense for them to skin the animals and sell the hides. And you might think, well, that's just recycling, right? Yes, in a way. But it also reinforced the executioner's grim reputation. Townspeople were simultaneously grateful for the service and horrified by the methods. Yes, thank you for taking the dead horse off our street. Also, grave digging and cemetery work. Another side hustle involved digging graves. Executioners were often contracted by local churches or city officials to maintain cemeteries. It makes a certain kind of sense if you're used to handling corpses and don't mind getting your hands dirty. Digging a hole in the ground is a minor inconvenience. Of course, grave digging was seasonal work, so it didn't replace the core execution duties, but it paid enough to keep the family stable when the town was in scheduling public beheadings every week. Plus, it gave executioners some additional authority. They were almost always the go-to person when it came to anything involving death. Need a burial fast? Call the executioner. Medical experiments and odd procedures. Now, here's where things get a little more eyebrow-raising. Some executioners got involved in early medical experiments. Not in the we'll cure diseases sense exactly, but more like anatomical studies. Cutting into criminals or dissecting animals gave them hands-on knowledge of anatomy. Occasionally, they would sell or trade their knowledge to budding physicians or university students curious about the inner workings of the human body. Again, it sounds weird, and yes, a bit creepy. But remember, executioner was one of the few people in the city who could reliably provide real, live examples of human anatomy. For medical schools, that was invaluable. And for the executioner, it was another revenue stream. Odd jobs nobody else would touch. Beyond corpses and medical oddities, executioners did a lot of jobs nobody else would do. Rat poison distribution, stray dog culling, enforcing unpopular city regulations like rounding up vagrants, acting as unofficial night watchmen. Basically, if your job made people uncomfortable or required a healthy respect for danger and death, the executioner was there. And because they were paid, they sometimes ended up wealthier than the average townsfolk. Despite being socially ostracized, the paradox of side hustles here is the thing. These side jobs reinforced both the executioner's indispensability and his social exile. Townspeople relied on him constantly, yet treated him like he was unclean or cursed. He might sell them a fresh cowhide, dig their child's grave, and fix a broken bone all in one day and still not be invited to the inn for supper. It's a life of strange contradictions. And yet, executioners seemed to manage. Families survived, children were raised, skills were passed down, and the profession continued to exist in this weird duality. Necessary, profitable, yet socially invisible. Now that we've tiptoed through public duties and side hustles, let's drift gently into the quieter corners, the domestic world of executioners. Because despite the reputation, the blood, and the occasional public spectacle, they had homes, families, routines, and, surprisingly, a fair amount of domestic normalcy. Well, normal in the context of someone whose day job involved axes, ropes, and occasionally scalping a cow. Homes on the edge, executioners almost always lived on the outskirts of town. Not because they liked fresh air, necessarily, but because townsfolk didn't want to walk past them every day. These homes were modest but functional. Some were provided by the town as part of the executioner's contract. Others were purchased with savings from wages and side hustles. The houses were often simple, 1 or 2 rooms, a kitchen, a small yard, maybe a shed for tools. Sometimes the family kept a small garden, sometimes a few chickens or goats, and yes, sometimes a workshop for sharpening swords, cleaning bones, or tanning hides. Imagine a cozy cottage with a roaring fireplace, except in the corner, there's a rack of axes gleaming in the light. A little grim, a little domestic. Family life. Executioners had families like anyone else. Children were born, raised, fed, and sent off to school or apprenticeships. Sons often learned the family trade, while daughters might marry within the limited social pool of executioner families or, in some rare cases, into other marginal professions. Daily life was a careful balance. The executioner had to be gentle at home, patient with children, and polite with a spouse, while maintaining the skills and demeanor of someone who could be called upon at a moment's notice to execute justice. It's a strange duality. Parent by day, town terror by official duty. Household routines. Mornings might begin with breakfast, tending to animals, or checking the garden. Mid-morning could involve repairing tools or sharpening blades. Afternoons might see him writing logs, running errands for the town, or delivering minor punishments. Evenings could include teaching children, helping a neighbor with an injury, or quietly enjoying ale in the kitchen. Despite appearances, executioners often maintained meticulous order. Tools were cleaned, ledgers kept, hides stored properly. The work required attention to detail both for the actual execution and the myriad of side hustles. Chaos could lead to mistakes, and mistakes, in this profession, were not taken lightly. Rituals and superstitions. Inside the home, there were rituals. Some executioners carried talismans or charms to ward off misfortune. After all, they dealt with death every day. Some families kept a small shrine or religious icon in the kitchen or workshop, a quiet appeal to divine protection. Others had routines to cleanse the home after executions or particularly gruesome workdays, sprinkling water, burning herbs, or simply airing out rooms. These were subtle ways to maintain some sense of normalcy and perhaps sanity, because living in constant proximity to death and fear takes its toll, even when the town never directly confronts you. Meals and ale. Food was simple, hearty, and practical. Stews, bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables were in season. Ale was common even for children in small amounts because water quality was poor. And, yes, ale also served as a mild form of stress relief for the executioner after particularly grim days. Occasionally, there might be meat from animals culled for hides or from the town's provisioning contracts, but luxury was rare, both because of social exclusion and practical necessity. The executioner's household was functional above all else. The quiet irony, it's this quiet, domestic life that is most ironic. Executioners were feared publicly, vilified socially, and yet they were often the ones quietly maintaining order in their households. Children grew up fed and clothed, tools kept sharp, logs perfectly organized. They were guardians of life and death in the abstract sense, and caretakers in the most tangible sense at home. It is a duality that seems impossible, simultaneously central to the town's function and yet entirely separate from its social life. It's almost like being essential, but invisible, an invisible backbone with a visible, terrifying face when duty called. As the evening drifts on and the fire dims in the hearth, we start to understand why executioners managed to sustain their families and traditions for generations. Despite constant social isolation, now, let us drift slowly into another curious corner of the executioner's life, festivals and public ceremonies. Because, believe it or not, even someone whose daily life involves decapitations and torture had to show up at celebrations. And, of course, these appearances were as awkward as you'd imagine. Participation in festivals. Medieval towns had a calendar full of festivals, harvest celebrations, saint days, and civic ceremonies. Executioners, despite their social stigma, were often required to attend. Their role wasn't glamorous. They weren't waving flags or leading dances. No, their presence was practical, symbolic, and occasionally performative. For example, during religious processions, the executioner might carry instruments of justice, chains, axes, or the dreaded halberd. It served as a visible reminder that law, order, and divine punishment were ever present. Villagers didn't exactly cheer. They whispered, pointed, or avoided eye contact. But the executioner had to march, keep his place, and look serious. No smiling allowed. Pageants and demonstrations. Some towns went further. Civic pageants often included demonstrations of the executioner's craft again, usually with props rather than actual heads. Axes were swung, stocks were displayed, ropes twirled. These were meant to show the town's commitment to law and order in a performative way. Think medieval safety demonstration, except with a grim aesthetic. Children often watched in silent fascination, though some screamed. Adults whispered about who might be next if laws weren't followed, and the executioner, standing there, in full uniform, probably wishing he could disappear behind the nearest cart of apples. Rituals around punishment. Interestingly, festivals sometimes involved ritualistic elements of justice. Mock trials, public confessions, or ceremonial punishments could be part of the spectacle. Executioners were central to these events. They didn't just administer punishment, they legitimized it. Their uniform, tools, and reputation reinforced the seriousness of the ceremony. Yet, these appearances were awkward. Villagers relied on the executioner to keep the law visible, but they also treated him like he was untouchable. Unapproachable. It was a strange dance of visibility and invisibility, essential to the performance, yet socially shunned the rest of the year. Rewards and taboos. Participation in festivals sometimes came with small perks, extra rations, symbolic gifts, or a few coins. But there were taboos too. Executioners could not participate fully in communal games, dances, or meals. They were allowed at the edges, observing, demonstrating, recording, but never quite joining. And there was the constant reminder, they were different. Children might point, neighbors whispered, and even in times of celebration, executioners felt the persistent weight of their role. Fun, for them, was complicated. The irony of public recognition, perhaps the strangest part, is that festivals, designed to unify the community, also reinforced the executioner's isolation. He was both celebrated and feared, acknowledged yet excluded. People needed him to remind them of justice, but they didn't want to eat at the same table. This paradox shaped the executioner's life as much as the block, the axe, or the ledger. It created a rhythm of participation and exclusion, of visibility and marginalization that defined the profession across generations. Now, let's gently float into one of the quieter, darker corners of an executioner's life, the mind. Because when the crowds dispersed, the festivals ended, and the axe rested on its stand, executioners were left alone with the weight of their duties. And make no mistake, it was a heavy weight. Constant exposure to death. Imagine seeing death every single day. Not the abstract, distant kind of death you read about in books, but the up-close, tangible, humankind. People who lived full lives, laughed, argued, and then, suddenly, were gone because the law demanded it. Executioners had to watch these transitions, often repeatedly. It wasn't just the act itself, the swing of the axe, the tightening of ropes. It was the preparation, the waiting, the whispered last words, and the lingering stench of fear. Every day was a reminder of mortality. And unlike soldiers or laborers, executioners didn't have the glory of battle or the distraction of toil. Their work demanded focus, precision, and detachment. Social isolation and alienation. We've touched on this before, but it's worth revisiting in the psychological context. Executioners were shunned, children cried, neighbors whispered, and spouses were often treated cautiously. Imagine living in a town where no one wants to invite you for supper, yet everyone expects you to be at their beck and call for the most personal, terrifying duties. This isolation created a unique type of stress. There were few outlets for conversation about their work. Confiding in neighbors was impossible. Clergy might preach at them rather than offer comfort. Even other executioners, if they existed nearby, were competitors or occasional collaborators, not friends in a modern sense. Rituals as coping mechanisms. To manage the mental toll, executioners developed routines and rituals. These weren't just practical, they were psychological armor. Repetition of tool cleaning and sharpening. A meditative act, keeping hands busy and mind steady. Detailed record keeping, turning gruesome acts into abstract numbers and notes. Distancing self from emotion. Religious observances, praying for the condemned or for personal protection. Blending duty with moral reassurance. Family interactions. Small domestic moments became sacred, grounding them in a normalcy otherwise denied. These rituals allowed executioners to survive mentally in a profession that few could endure for more than a decade or two without significant stress. The emotional paradox. Executioners often displayed a strange paradox of emotion. Publicly, they were detached, precise, professional. Privately, many wrestled with guilt, fear, or sadness. Historical letters and diaries hint at men who occasionally wept after executions, fretted over mistakes, or mourned condemned individuals quietly. And yet, life demanded resilience. Mistakes could be fatal, socially and professionally. Hesitation at the wrong moment could have serious consequences, not just for the condemned, but for the executioner's position. So they learned to compartmentalize. Duty came first, emotion second. Long-term psychological effects. Long-term effects varied. Some executioners became calloused, almost mechanical, turning the act of death into routine. Others developed anxiety, insomnia, or nightmares, hardly surprising given their proximity to fear and mortality. Yet, there were cases of executioners who lived relatively peaceful later years, retiring with families intact, skills passed on, and a quiet pride in their essential role. Interestingly, the profession itself created a kind of identity that outlasted the individual. Executioners were not merely people who killed, they were symbols, guardians, bureaucrats, and sometimes teachers. This identity, for better or worse, shaped how they processed the emotional and psychological burden. The paradox of respect and fear. Finally, it's worth noting the strange social paradox. Executioners were feared, yes, but also respected in some ways. They were reliable, skilled, and indispensable. Some towns even deferred to them on legal matters or minor disputes, recognizing their judgment as connected to law, morality, and order. Yet, this respect never fully erased fear. Even in retirement, the shadow of their work lingered. People remembered what they had done. Families remembered, and in some cases, executioners themselves never forgot, carrying the memories quietly for decades.